thank you for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here to talk to you about this CAS publication that's just released. First, I would like to acknowledge my task force members. When we started putting this publication together, we intentionally wanted to represent the variety of disciplines that make up agricultural research. And then we also wanted to make sure that we had a representative of a data reuser. So we have Allison Eagle from the Environmental Defense Fund. We have animal scientists, foods and nutrition represented. We have agronomy, soil science, genomics, phenomics. And then we also have, we needed a data scientist. So we have Cindy Parr from National Agricultural Library who helped us out. What was the motivation for doing this commentary? Well, next generation problem solving, I think there's general agreement that we're going to have to do science a bit differently, and we need to do big transdisciplinary research projects that address these complex questions. And not only do we need to link the disciplines, but we need to link the data. And right now, a major barrier to making better agricultural decisions is lack of data sharing and data accessibility. The other motivator was that we're talking about publicly funded research data, and it belongs to the public, and so therefore it should be more readily available for reuse. So our goal was really to advance the conversation among ag science partners to create a system that is conducive to data sharing as an underpinning for the science needed to address grand challenge questions. We wanted to document the need and the benefits of developing data standards, incentivizing sharing, building data sharing infrastructure that meets the needs of producers. We also had some things we thought should be happening. So our topics for today are first a bit of a historical perspective on data and the process of conducting research to highlight really why we currently don't share data. I want to give you our vision for the new data ecosystem. We have 4 imperatives that we came up with and 4 critical strategies to facilitate data sharing. I'll close with some comments on the partners who need to be involved to make this successful, and then some thoughts on the business model. Open data is not free, and so there will be costs, and we need to talk about how to pay for it. What is small science versus big science? So let's just clarify that distinction right now as a foundation from which we're speaking. Small science, hypothesis-driven research led by single researchers or a small team generating and analyzing their own results. I think it's really important to just keep in mind that when we think about the way we used to do science and we call it small science, that the science we call small today was yesterday's big science. So let's make sure we recall that. Why did we do it that way? Well, we can certainly say that's what we could do with the research tools and technologies. We had limited data collection and data management tools. Labs weren't all computerized. The equipment was, you hand wrote down data. We had limited or no access to computational power. And then just as an add-in, there wasn't really any reason we thought about data sharing. And so if you stored and tried to share data, it was definitely an individual enterprise. We've gotten a long way doing science that way. For those of you that made it through 10th grade bio, I'm sure you know who Gregor Mendel was. If you made it through sophomore year college stats, you probably know who Ronald Fisher was. He was the individual who put together the array of statistical tools that people were thinking about using into really a package that came to underpin a lot of the way we do science in many, many disciplines. And he worked at Rothamsted. That's what that little picture is. And right up till today, my colleague, World Food Prize winner Gabisa Ejeda, has done tremendous amounts of work and huge impact in areas such as striga resistance and sorghums. Just to clarify how small science works, we put together a diagram of the small science environment that's in this commentary, and it just highlights that you've got individual researchers from the individual disciplines. doing their research, accessing, proposing for research dollars to a variety of funding organizations. They receive funding, they do their project. Typically, they have collected and kept the data on their local computers. Once they've done enough with their data, then they'll typically publish the cool part of it in a peer-reviewed journal. And then typically a lot of that data that doesn't get published. And so this is what we call dark data. It's on computers, nobody knows it's there, and it's not accessible for anybody to even think about using. The outcomes of this environment are, first and foremost, you probably already know this, that up until recently, almost all article data was not, or articles themselves were not open. They were behind subscription paywalls. So anybody who wanted to access, to make a recommendation or to develop a policy, had to pay to access the knowledge that was in journals. There were also no reason to explicitly link the little knowledge fragments. You did your own thing, you put it in a journal, and it was left up to the users to figure out how to stitch things together. This was even more challenging because the research wasn't done in a transdisciplinary way. So outcome, lots of inaccessible and often lost data. And then also another problem is that what is getting accessed via journals is partial, and because it's only partial, it has some probability of being potentially biased as a foundation for a recommendation or policy. This has been the subject of scientific study itself. This publication came out 2012, a little while ago. I don't expect things have changed, but it's an analysis of results in those journals. And basically the rest of the story is that the null result is a bit of an endangered species. If this group of researchers looked at 242 papers in agriculture, over 4,000 across disciplines, and they were looking to see how many of them, what proportion reported a positive result. So nothing happened, not I did the research and nothing happened, not I did the research and I ended off with a worse result than nothing happening, but that it was a good thing, it was cool, it was interesting. And these authors of this paper hypothesized that research is either becoming less pioneering or objectivity in the publication is decreasing, and that's that let's publish the cool piece. It's also journals that prioritize the innovation in the article that they publish. So other reasons to think about sharing, I talked about grand challenge questions, but the other thing about addressing complex system questions is that we now understand that when we analyze a system with the objective of improving people's lives one way or another, there are going to be multiple objectives among stakeholders. And when you do sort of a small science approach, you're typically saying, okay, this works, that doesn't. You cannot put together everything in a way that you can weight potential choices. So if we're going to do the research for complex systems and we're going to enable people to look at the trade-offs and think about what's best for their community to do, we need to change how we do science. And so again, a nice article discussing this that says if we're going to look at big problems and produce an array of potential solutions for various components, we need to be able to integrate over different levels of detail. Finally, good reason to share, in theory, is public trust. If you share your research materials and your raw data, all of it, you are then inherently being transparent in your disclosure of methods and results. If you collaborate to make sure you do it in a way that your results can be integrated to make big data out of small, so I do an end response study in Indiana and my data can be combined with somebody doing that in Illinois, you're going to enhance the inference space of the result and the reliability of your research result for use in places where you haven't potentially tested it. And again, in theory, that should increase public trust in and use of science. We're in curious times, but that's the theory. Why is so much data not shared and or lost? Just a few more comments on this. I'm sure that what pops into some people's head when I talk about this is the scoop, the thinking that researchers are, they invested a lot of effort in creating their data, and therefore they're going to sit on it until they've derived all the value they possibly can out of it. And there's also been some past perceptions of individual ownership of data. I think we're getting to a point where people understand they don't actually own the data if it's been funded by somebody else. They need to look at their contract, etc. But this note was actually handed to a colleague of mine who was giving a talk on the value of data sharing, and it was somewhat facetious. I know the individual, but I think it illustrates the culture. You can have my data when you pry it out of my cold, dead hard drive. I would say a more common reason we don't is that there's this perception that our data are not understandable by anybody else, or certainly somebody outside the discipline. And it is true that different disciplines speak different languages. They annotate their data in different ways. That is part of why, if you do not plan ahead of time to share your data, so you don't start from the get-go, and you don't have guides and tools for workflows that make it easier to do than not to do, you end up in this situation where your knowledge of the data itself is going to degrade extremely rapidly once you're done with the project. So if you think about the knowledge value of data, it's got a high value. It's got its highest value while you're right there working with it, probably even after you've started your grant, and you can open up a spreadsheet and you can say exactly what any number means. However, the second you move on to the next project, if you have not appropriately prepared your data for reuse, the knowledge starts to erode. Even your knowledge starts to erode. I have opened files of my own, looked at them and said, I have no idea what these were. And so it's not just for others, it's for you. So your ability to even go back and rescue data starts to go down quite quickly. As you move further away, for example, you get to change jobs or you retire or something like that, your knowledge can really drop off to nothing, and that's when your data dies. And then, of course, at any point, should something bad happen to the corporate memory, I call this hit by the bus problem, that value could just be lost entirely. And as we face retirements in academia, in ag research, or throughout ag research, this is what might happen to a lot of data. So the reality is that data sharing is hard. It takes time and money. We have not been taught how to do it. Data literacy hasn't been part of the curriculum. I wasn't taught how to do it. We do have some things that make it easier than a paper and pencils, but Excel is not a low barrier solution. It's inadequate to the task. It was a low barrier solution to some aspects of pen and pencil, but not everything. And then there is been the issue of, if you actually bothered to prepare your data, what would you do with it? Where would you put it? So looking forward, if you want to but if you do not want data to die, you want it to give it a second life and extend its life cycle, the first thing you're going to have to do is anticipate the reuse. And to anticipate the reuse, you've got to follow what has now been is called the FAIR principles, and that is that your data are prepared in such a way that they are findable, accessible, interoperable, in a broadly applicable language with fair vocabularies, And that makes them reusable because they are richly described, and it's easy to see their provenance, they have a usage license, they meet domain standards, etc. So to be of its highest value, data have to be made fair. So what is the ecosystem for, well, team science, but we're also going to continue to have, individual specialty data sets produced. But what is the ecosystem that facilitates data sharing? Well, as I've just said, a key attribute is that data collection is done a priori anticipating reuse. So you have a team, big or small, and they are certainly going to continue to publish the interesting results so that people can see and use those, and knowledge will certainly flow to stakeholders that way. But if we look at the key attributes, we're looking at a shift in that all data that goes with a publication, which some of that is happening now, that the data that is with the publication is getting published, sometimes in the same spot, sometimes in a dedicated repository. But we're looking at making sure that all the project data ends up getting prepared for reuse, and a bunch doesn't end up on the cutting room floor. We are also very certain that we need to do something more than just repositories. So this notion of knowledge bases, where not only do you have a repository function, but you have expert services to enhance the data collections for anticipated reuse. If I am going to prepare a data set, I can make it fair without doing some additional things to perhaps add value to the data set. Maybe fuse it with some other data set. So if you have a dedicated team of experts that can collaborate with researchers or research teams and with potential stakeholders, you can anticipate and create some of these high value data products. And then your stakeholders, they get to not just get knowledge out of journals, but they can access data for their own research, for innovation, for use in policy and recommendation, and so forth. Okay, what are the imperatives? We came up with a few, and I think clearly the first is the development and implementation of best practices for data management in all federally funded projects. So we need data and metadata standards. I just showed you the classic example here of railroad widths and the fact that they're not standardized across the world, and it certainly makes it difficult to get from here to there. Data sharing is impeded by the lack of standards. So my favorite example happens to be with this what is yield, and the fact that a number is often not accompanied with enough description to know whether or not it's at zero moisture content or other attributes of yield. I won't go into them now. Okay, second imperative, we've got to think about how to incentivize it, incentivize sharing, and develop some mechanisms for making gray and dark data available. So an example of both incentives and mechanisms, the fertilizer industries for our research fund, that's contributed by major fertilizer companies and put together for the purposes of having research done in soil fertility and plant nutrition. They decided, money talks, they decided that they were going to withhold a proportion of a grant award until not only were the general results submitted to the funding agency that reported upon, but also all data were prepared for reuse, for sharing and reuse. It might still be embargoed, released 12 months from now or something like that, but it was prepared for reuse. They then turn around, and we actually ended up getting a grant from the 4R fund to create a repository, a mechanism for our fund researchers to prepare and publish their data, because many of the awardees did not have that mechanism available to them. And so then this is actually just, I'm just showing you a different contract that I now have with them for ongoing research, and they're withholding 10% until I make that data available at the end of the project. Third imperative, coordination amongst existing and emerging initiatives, networks, repositories. It's a really busy space out there. There's lots going on. This is not, this commentary is not implying that nothing has happened. There are a lot of things going on, and we highlight some of them, not everything that's going on. And then these are just a few of examples we talk about, everything from the Ag Data Coalition, which is a public-private partnership between universities and private entities. Things like Data One, it's an NSF-funded database. The institutional repositories, we have one at Purdue. National Ag Libraries has the Ag Data Commons. And then there's specialty repositories like the Maize database. So the biggest challenge, it's great that all this stuff going on, but it's confusing. And the sheer number of these things is posing a challenge to a coordinated landscape that is useful and usable to most people. And then I think it's worth noting that each of these entities faces their own sustainability issues. So we have to figure out how to sustain the initiatives and efforts that are going to be out there and that rise to the top. Finally, we really did think it was important that we look to developing this value-added knowledge-based infrastructure, hardware, software, human resources, so that we can curate, preserve, and get that added value. That is where you get the bang for your buck in return on investment in science. What are strategies? We identified 4 major ones, and I'm going to start with probably amongst the most important is connecting the feedbacks. You have to ask the user what's going to be useful to them in terms of data. So we need to ensure that we're linking hypotheses to the real world needs, that the data we're producing will be useful in its broadest extent. And that may also lead us to some prioritization of actionable science at scale, what we choose to do. I can give you many examples of stakeholders that want data. So there's groups working on ecosystem service valuation, food supply chain sustainability metrics. Many people want data to support apps. So we need to be talking to those stakeholders to make sure we understand what sort of data products are going to be the most useful. We need to look at leveraging what we've already got. We have a lot of data, as I mentioned, that are dark and may be about to die, and some of those may be some really priceless, that it will be extremely expensive and take a very long time to recreate some of these data sets from long-term research facilities and observing environmental changes in soil carbon, etc. So we want to look at triaging and rescuing legacy data sets and surfacing gray and dark data that is currently being produced. We also need to look at how we structure teams and make sure that we have the people who can help us not just analyze the results for our own purpose, but prepare it for reuse, make these data fusions, bridge gaps, etc. So we're talking about engaging data scientists, creating novel teams, and this is much more than our historic approach of interdisciplinary research, where either you cut out a piece for a fellow economist or you ask a data scientist to help with analytics or code or something like that, but you're not really working together. In terms of institutional reorienting, we highlight a number of things that we can do. I will speak of an example from my own institution, academic institution, that we now fully recognize that we have to permeate our curriculum with data literacy and computational literacy opportunities. One thing that we have become painfully aware of is that digital natives, people who grow up with apps in their hands, actually don't necessarily know a whole lot about how data are structured. They can use apps, there are ways, some can even create apps, but their knowledge of the structure of data is actually fairly. Who do we need to partner? There are a lot of partners that need to participate to to have success. So we're not just talking about the domain scientists and the data scientists who might work together and use data infrastructure. We need informaticians. They're the people who figure out how to describe and preserve and curate data in such a way that that you can find it and have confidence in the meaning of what you're finding. Science administrators work to create the environment to make this happen on campuses, in institutes, etc. They need to be part of the conversation. Professional societies have historically set the standards for what we want to do. Funding agency, money talks. They are the ones who can set policies to encourage the data products that they want to see within their entities. Private publishers have a role. The whole open access movement is going to change the way we not only position papers, but potentially data. And then there are a vast array of other stakeholders. I think the bottom line is that we need all these partners to commit to a collaborative process where we do iterative analysis and we try things, and we will have failures, but we will have successes, and we need to collectively design infrastructure and implement it that has the utility that we're seeking. Finally, I have to talk about cost of all of this. Not that I am an economist or know much about the cost of this system, but open access is not cost-free, and so the question is, who pays for this ecosystem? So this was a study. If we're thinking about open data infrastructure, it's a public good. So these pie chart and data are from a study that was done on the longevity of databases. Basically, what sorts of things survived 18 years. And basically, these are biological databases. A quarter of them made it in some shape or form. Only 16% were genuinely alive at the end of 18 years, and the vast majority were dead. And the differentiator between living and dying was whether or not there was core institutional support. And the authors point out that it's really inefficient to spend all this, spend a big grant on creating a database, a short-term grant, only to have it operate. So, who pays? Does the user pay? So somebody's going to pay. How do we set up these systems? So a long time ago, when I first started trying to think about sharing data, there was a cost with sharing it, prepping it for other use. And I went to my administration and I said, can I charge people for the data? And they laughed at me. They're like, who would buy your data? I think times have changed, obviously, but we are still in this position of who's going to pay for this stuff? And so this was just a paper that looked at pay to submit, pay to use, different, voluntary contribution, a freemium model. So these are both examples and models of payment. And freemium is what a lot of people are thinking of, where you access some of it, but if you want premium services, you're going to have to pay for it. So that poses the question is, if you have to pay for something, or you pay a subscription, is it open access? This is another look at funding models for data by origin of revenue. And I think what we need to look, so this looks at academic versus third party versus commercial users versus some hybrid models. That's what razors and blades are. We give you the razor, you buy the blades. You need to ask the question, which are open access compliant and equitable? So in this case, I think 1 to 4 in the academic users public funding model would meet those. which are stable. That's as important. And I think 1 and 2 are, and I made this slide actually last summer, and I put maybe 3 in red. And now I have an example. The International Plant Nutrition Institute we created a repository for them, and they're dissolving. So you have to think about how stable an institution is going to be, whether that's going to be a stable model. Our team kind of liked this infrastructure model where funding dollars are basically allocated not for just for data management within the timeline of the project, but for the afterlife of that data's management. So something flows to knowledge base for funding that data. So some final thoughts. In terms of infrastructure, I think we felt that the most cost-effective and robust solutions might just be a mix of things that we know about and then some innovation as well. So we don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel if there are things out there that are working. Leadership and oversight. There's lots of opportunity for leadership amongst the various partners, but if we're thinking about federal leadership, the USDA Research and Economics Office, the Office of the Chief Scientist in partnership with the Office of the Chief Information Officer seem like logical choices because that's a natural extension. Stewardship of research data would extend their historic roles and responsibilities in nurturing public research. Farm Bill opportunities. The Farm Bill created the Agriculture Advanced Research and Development Authorities. One of the task force members was involved in the early thinking of this, and his notion is if we get this fully appropriated, AgARDA would be in a position to address the infrastructure that we've highlighted, the needs we've highlighted here. If AgARDA does get the go-ahead to lead a partnership that's going to deliver these benefits to stakeholders in the ag data value chain, how would they start? Well, I hate to say, let's have more meetings, but I think we do need to bring together the stakeholders to understand better what stakeholders want to be able to do with data. And then I think we also need to convene USDA leadership, high-level meetings, because it's going to take some collective courage to create, plan, operationalize, and stick with deploying trial and error, that kind of thing, infrastructure that really works and meets the objectives that we see as necessary. So I'd be happy to take questions if there are any, and I thank you for your time.
So I'll go first. We were asked as panelists to provide our reaction to the paper, but I was one of the authors, so my first reaction is thank goodness it's finally released.
It's over.
And another reaction is to thank Sylvie for the really monumental job of pulling it together. And as she mentioned, the authors for this paper had to come from various different backgrounds so that we could really provide a very comprehensive view of this topic. And so kudos to Sylvie for navigating, as you mentioned, people have different languages. Sometimes it's hard to talk about this stuff. So we managed to get to the end of this. But the other reaction I have is so much stuff happened while we were doing this paper and it's still happening. So I thought my reaction to it is there's a lot of late-breaking stuff that didn't make it into the paper that Sylvie started to talk about, the Farm Bill, AgARDA development, but there's a few other things I thought I should share. So, and some of these, the other comment is most of what Sylvie has talked about is not specific to agriculture, right? These are very general topics. In the paper, we do talk about some specifics relating to ag. So I'm going to start first with talking about the overall landscape for data and some of the most recent developments. So on January 14th of this year, the Open Government Data Act was signed into law. Open stands for Open, Public, Electronic, and Necessary. And in part what this did was it took some executive orders from the previous administration and basically put it into law. So these things won't be going away. We're still trying to digest the language of that law and figure out what are the implications for research data, because primarily I think the goal was to just talk about government-generated data in general for transparency and taxpayer support reasons. But there are implications, I think, and USDA thinks, for research data. So we're still trying to figure out what are those implications for us at USDA. Even more recently, only a month ago on February 11th, the president signed an executive order on an artificial intelligence initiative. And the idea is to invest in research and development, generate standards for AI work, and to do work on workforce development. Again, all things that we talked about in this CAST commentary, but now there's even more fire, I think, under the effort because of this very clearly stated, push for better support and other investment in AI. Finally, I just want to say at the overall government level, the National Science and Technology Council convenes an open science subcommittee within the Science Committee that's overseen by the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And in this subcommittee on open science, representatives from all the relevant science agencies come together to work to align all their activities across the government with respect to particularly public access to products of research funding, so both journal articles and especially data. And this group has been extremely active in the last year. It was actually chartered under the previous administration. We weren't sure what was going to happen. It's been rechartered, re-energized. We're actively working on this. And the implications of the work that we're doing is to try to make it easier for academics to comply with the policy that's coming out department by department and to leverage all this data that's becoming available for new research, regardless of which agency has funded the work. So stay tuned. You'll see probably a lot more on that in the next 6 months to 12 months. Now, particularly at USDA and at the National Ag Library, I want to talk about 4 programs that I'm involved with that are relevant to the CAST commentary. The first one is the Ag Data Commons. As Sylvie mentioned, and it is in the paper, this is an effort that I'm leading at the National Ag Library, which begins to fulfill at least some of the infrastructure requirements that Sylvie outlined, particularly providing fair access to data, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. In particular, we're both a catalog and a repository. So we know that there's already a lot of open data out there. It's coming out in many different locations. Some of them are dedicated databases. Sometimes it's data in associated with a paper in a journal. Sometimes it's data on people's websites. So we're a catalog of where all that data is, to the extent possible, the data that's funded by USDA research agencies. But we're also a repository for the data that doesn't have a good home. So we don't want to replace some of these specific repositories that are tailored to their communities and the work that those communities are doing, but we don't want it to be lost, as Sylvie mentioned. Of course, there's a sustainability issue. So our goal is to be a sustainable platform. We're operated by the US government, but we're working on the business model for how we can make sure that that support doesn't go away. It's an open source platform, so we're trying to, practice what we preach. So this is a community developed package that we're tailoring not just for agricultural research data, but for anybody to use around the world for research data dissemination and publication. And finally, we're working to make the platform promote as much as possible machine readability, because we're trying to do our best to consistently describe the data in a structured way, not just for USDA produced data, intramural data, but also for the extramural data that university academics are producing. So that's one piece of what the National Ag Library is trying to do to support these efforts. The second one is we've launched a service to consult on data management plans. So as Sylvie mentioned, you don't want to get to the end of your project and then realize you have to do this. You really want to think about it up front. So we're inviting researchers, particularly ARS researchers, but we're also working with librarians at land-grant universities around the country to promote similar practices. Basically, we'll review a draft data management plan before you submit it to your funding agency so that we can help make sure that good practice for data sharing and use of standards is there, and that the project has the best success at being funded by their agency. The third thing I want to talk about are a couple of meetings that have workshops that have been funded by NIFA. Sylvie mentioned that she gave part of this presentation in a workshop that I hosted last summer. This is DIRAC, Data-Driven Innovation in Agriculture, or something like that. I don't know.
I don't know. There's
Data, innovation, agriculture, it's all in there.
Data or something like that.
Yeah, DIDAC. So we had a meeting last summer where we brought together librarians, information science professionals to work with scientists, researchers to figure out what are the best practices in two particular domains, dairy science and agricultural economics. We're going to have a follow-on meeting, hopefully later this summer, to bring in some ag extension folks, again with librarians. So we're doing our best to change that culture by getting input and helping to bring everybody up to a standard where people are using best practices. And then the final thing I want to mention is that we have been piloting a program of data science in the library, and we've done this in part by funding fellowships at the University of Maryland, and also by hiring contractors who are relatively fresh out of data science programs. And what we're trying to do is build capacity within USDA for understanding how do you recruit data scientists, how do you manage data scientists, what kind of problems can data science address, and then we're expecting out of all this that those folks will give us feedback on how best we can make data available for use by data scientists. So the point I want to leave you with is there's a lot of policy still in the process of being made, and this paper has just come out, but we can't wait for all the answers, so we're in parallel, we're doing a lot to actually build the infrastructure and build the capacity to support the kind of work that the commentary is suggesting is to happen. Thanks.
First of all, I want to thank the two of you and your team and CAST for producing a really interesting and very meaty report that not only takes on the huge issue of the need to get agriculture's data house in order, which is big on its own, but weaving in there other major issues that are also in their own right difficult. For example, just the whole issue of negative results, publishing negative results or null results, reproducibility, as you mentioned in there, the reward system for people engaging in their interdisciplinary science, which has been talked about for a long time, and the ability to make teams. I know that that probably was not the intention of the paper to suggest that all research in the future ought to be, maybe it was, but I don't think it was completely expected that all research in the future would be team research. Of course, the premise that we have grand challenges that are best addressed by teams, I think, could be justified. And you mentioned the Science Breakthroughs report that came out of the Academy recently that I think would also agree with your view on that. But of course, not all questions in agricultural science are grand challenge questions. So one thought I had as I was reading it was, well, whether or not the research is done by teams, interdisciplinary teams, or single investigators, nevertheless, that data from a single investigator-driven, hypothesis-driven research ought to still be fair. Right? So hopefully there needs to be imbued in the culture a need to make data fair. I thought that, to me, the things that you identified, having this become a cultural norm is going to underpin a lot of the success of this ultimately. And just parenthetically, I'll say that, it's like almost 18 years ago this month that the first sequence of the human genome was published. And one version of it was published by the International Consortium in Nature, and another was published in Science by Craig Venter and his colleagues from Celera. And if you wanted to see the underlying data of that sequence related to the Nature paper, you could go to GenBank that NCBI, I think, is the curator of. But if you wanted to see the shotgun sequence that Craig Venter's shop had delivered, you would have to go behind like a paywall. I think there was some ability to get in there for sort of no cost if you were an academic. So he'd already set up walls to let people come in, which created kind of a fury in the academic community, and such that at the National Academy of Sciences, we actually did a study that was chaired by Tom Cech, who was a Nobel Prize winner, member of the Academy, that said, it was called sort of sharing publication-related data and materials. And in order to get the credit, basically the report said, in order to be deserving of the credit that publication gives you, you're obliged as a cultural norm of our community to share this information. So after that report came out, science changed its policy, and any genomic sequence after that had to be deposited in a repository. So journals, as you said, are part of the incentive structure. The issue of best practices, I think what Cynthia, what you just described is certainly essential and needed, and it's going to take a lot of work by subgroups of the communities, and I do hope the National Ag Library, maybe in concert with other agencies like the National Science Foundation, and certainly other federal agencies that need to organize this for their communities to take this on. And also, you mentioned teaching and training people how to annotate their data so that it can be fair, compliant. And we are going to need data scientists, and my only worry is that there's such a demand for data scientists so we're going to have to, I think, grow our own. And so I really feel as though there will have to be programs, fellowships, like you say, to bring people in, because we're not necessarily going to be able to recruit the people that Google is, and Amazon right over the river will be grabbing up. So how do we do that? And then finally, it's very interesting, the infrastructure that's needed, how to pay for it is an important question. The human genome sequence costs like $2 billion, but after that, I remember Francis Collins made an effort to try to go after, he was thinking very big, not only did he want sequence, that he wanted there to be publication and kind of control by the public of gene sequences. There was this mad dash to take these little things called ESTs and make genes out of it, because he knew that he could leverage private sector information and keep it out of the hands of those who would want to keep it from the public. But the value of the human genome sequence and the annotation that's gone into it since then, I think, is way bigger than $2 billion. And just now we're seeing personalized medicine. So if we could realize that kind of value for sustainability and productivity in a time of trying to feed the 9 billion people, the cost, the value of that would be innumerable. And I will just say then that one of the perhaps rationales for undertaking this was transparency, and you referenced the Cochrane Collaborative in your paper. And I have seen the Cochrane Collaborative, but I haven't really delved into their work. A lot of it has to do with, I think, public health kinds of issues. But a girlfriend of mine who is not in science at all, she's a retired teachers union representative, but she's really into different kind of foods and whether or not they give you certain health benefits. And so I just wrote down what she wrote to me. I said, tell me more about this, why you like this. And she says, I like how the Cochrane Library talks about biases, methodology, subject group, etc. It's like they've done the screening for you. And there is a plain language summary in the abstract so that non-statisticians can understand it. You can see why I donate to them. So the dream scenario is that the average member of the public can find a place where they can get information synthesized on the basis of, in that case, it was systematic reviews, which are very rigorous. It may not have complete applicability all the time to the kind of questions in agriculture, but that a member of the public just sees so much value in it that they're willing to donate. And then I'll end by just saying that today I was over at EPA with a bunch of corn growers who were talking about the renewable fuel standard, which has to be evaluated every couple of years on the basis of its environmental impacts. And talking about layering National Ag Statistics Service data with imagery, and the issue is whether or not demand for ethanol has turned grasslands into cornfields, and what the environmental consequences of that are. And there were so many data layers that they were talking about there, including CRP data, sodbuster, this kind of that. And I was just thinking, as I was anticipating coming over here, just how many questions are going to be relevant for this. So thank you for this first step towards what I hope is a community-wide discussion.
And the benefit of going last on the panel is that you've already dug into all of the really meaty stuff that I get to just tag on. So I wanted just to start by saying the very first thing that jumped out at me about this paper was how small scale a lot of agriculture science is compared to so many other types of science. And while I know that, it took a long time for the agriculture research community, for example, to even have like a decadal vision for the future, whereas groups like the physicists do this every 10 years to what is physics going to do, and they have these big projects. And medicine certainly has also the budget for doing these big studies. And so the challenge of integrating those small studies and in these hyper-localized kind of situations in agriculture where you could literally do the exact same research but in two different counties in the same state and get a very different result based on watershed, based on everything. 2 different years apart, you could get a different result based on the weather. That to me really drove home how challenging this is going to be and how important it's going to be. And oftentimes when I think about interoperability and big data sets, my first thought is electronic medical records, how we can't even get that together, and there's so much money and there's so much effort, and the government has been working, like saying, you need to do this. You've got hospital networks, you have insurance networks, you have patient networks. Ag doesn't have any of this stuff. And yet, with electronic medical records, we can't even get interoperability. Like, what hope do we have, really, ladies? I mean, what are we going to do? And yet, it was very encouraging when Sylvie gave her presentation. I was also in attendance at an earlier presentation today and mentioned some of the young students in her lab, where she said beforehand you would have students come in and they didn't want to work with old data sets. And then this time, now she's starting to have students who do, who see the value in that. And I think, this next generation, they're going to be the people who appreciate interoperability from the start, who appreciate what kinds of metadata might be useful to tag what they're doing for other people. Maybe they're already thinking about hashtag whatever for their data, and how fundamentally useful this is going to be moving forward. So I actually have a lot more hope. Sorry, keys. I have a lot more hope for moving forward in this endeavor, especially with respect to all of these little studies, because especially with the little studies, people want to have a bigger influence. And maybe if you have a big study, you have no incentive to play nice with all the other big studies. But if you have, if you're representative of a community that is used to this small scale science, maybe there's going to be a community of people saying maybe we should interoperate, I guess, a little bit better. Which also brings me to one of Robin's points about training and workforce and the data workforce in general. I mean, when Sylvie says this is not an ag-specific problem, that is absolutely true. And bringing data scientists or information scientists, librarians into this process is not going to be easy because there is so much competition. And you can advertise such an endeavor as this is, food, and it's cool, and people like food, and it's interesting, and the idea of it being globally important, more so than even these days, like working for Facebook or Google, maybe that would be something attractive to someone, some young new data scientist who's interested in making impact. On the other hand, a lot of what we do in the policy office has to do with our budget in terms of our resources, and paying for those data scientists when there is competition. I mean, there's that equilibrium, right? Maybe you'll take a slightly lower salary if it means you're making a really big impact. How much of a lower salary are you going to take? And how can we justify spending so much more on a data scientist than on research? Where is that balance going to lie? And the last thing that I was also thinking about, especially with respect to my optimism moving forward, is my utter pessimism about the past and how difficult it will be to catalog all of the data that we already have. It's not interoperable, that's not searchable, it's not fair, that has no metadata, that was collected without thinking about those other pieces, and how, like, my own lab notebooks from grad school are probably on a shelf somewhere with data that someone might find useful, might have found useful, but now never will. And whether, moving forward with electronic notebooks, or with standards in place, or with kind of that forward-thinking mindset, that would be really terrific. But really, already, how much has been lost already, and the kind of the imperative of kind of getting to work on this now, so that it's not, we don't continue to lose all of this valuable data, especially the null data, because believe you me, I had plenty of that in graduate school. And knew plenty of others that also had null data that, when they finally were able to communicate with others in their fields, others said, oh, I did that same experiment, I had the same result. And how heartbreaking that is to think how much time and money did we waste, all 5 of us doing that same experiment without any success, because there was no way to communicate, even among colleagues at a scientific conference or something, to communicate an experiment that did not.
This doesn't work.
Yes. So all of that data, having that out there as unpublished, but perhaps available, it's very exciting, and I hope we do figure out a way to do it and to tag it and to make it appropriately fair, so that no one has to go through what we all went through in getting something that was actually meaningful.
Thank you. Let's give a round of applause to Sylvie and to the next question. We're going to open up for question and answer, and the question's going to be directed to either Sylvie or to any of the panelists about just follow on to maybe comments they made during the presentation. So we'll open it up to the floor for any questions or comments that you all would like to share. Dan.
I have 7 questions so far. Depending on your answers, I may end up with more questions. My name is Dan. Should I be using this?
Go ahead, for the recording might pick up there.
Well, okay, I'll use it, but I'm not sure. Am I? My name is Dan Silverstein. I'm a private sector advisor, which means that I'm not a scientist, not a researcher, never have been, don't know very little about it. I view the world through the prism of what's the practical application, and mostly how do publicly funded institutions engage private capital in order to support whatever they're doing. I'm also not a diplomat, and so if in fact, so there's two contingencies here. It's possible that nothing that I ask you is going to make any sense to you, and the second thing is I may be very blunt. With that in mind, my first two thoughts are this. Where have we been? Why are we having this conversation now? I don't deal with these things, but I just always assume when I go through my daily activities and I hear about big data, and I just assume that someone was codifying this, was curating it, that it wasn't just all out in the ether. So I'm surprised to hear this, and I wanted to couch this in the terms of not being a diplomat, because it seems to me like the Agricultural Research Service would have been a logical place to start to do this. And so my first intervention would be, oh yes, we've been working on this for years and maybe whatever. That's the first thing. The second thing is, as I've been sitting here and listening, this sounds like what I hear about seed banks. That there are indigenous seeds that nobody really knows anything about except the local constituency, but it's incredibly important, and it lends itself to the agrobiodiversity of the world, and so we end up with genome banks and repositories. Somebody has organized all that. So is that a valid analogy to make, that in effect what you're seeking to do is to bring these disparate bits of data into some kind of a banking system, a data banking system, where it then becomes useful to the public? And I have multiple. Thank you for that.
Who's looking at him here? I think the analogy with a seed bank is partially correct. And the reason I say that is from my perspective as someone who also has an extension appointment. So my job is to take applied research and turn it into practice. I will say that the culture has been that you might do some confirmatory studies, but there's no need to publish those. You just go out and you talk about your results, you produce a white paper or something. And there's a tremendous amount of data that it is lost. I'm not sure as I would characterize it as, maybe it is, maybe it's hidden gems of biodiversity in the data sets, characterizing response of corn to soil test levels. But because we're only getting the partial bit out there, there's all this other stuff. So if you have one really cool result, and maybe you get another cool result out there, these are small studies, you don't really have much of an inference space for a generalized recommendation. You have enough you can describe what happened, but you can't turn that into a probabilistic explanation of what's going to happen someplace else. You need to know, you need to put together all the similar types of studies that showed no effect, showed maybe only a marginal effect. Maybe they showed a much bigger effect than the first study, but it's not novel. So to me, there's an aspect of comprehensiveness, maybe not so much novelty, but comprehensiveness that we're trying to capture in that database. Question of why it took Ag so long? All I'll say was I inherited, and then I'm going to let other people talk to this, but as an assistant professor, I inherited the task of overseeing a long-term research facility at Purdue. And I was trying to get tenure, and people would come and they would just want the data. And it would turn up in publications with no credit to me, and I was told, tisk, you can't do that. And so one, it took my time. Every time somebody came to me and wanted data, I had to get them the data product they wanted out of that data set. And then I got no credit for it. So I got this notion, the second I was tenured, I was like, I'm gonna put my data in the library, and then people can go just check it out. And I had no idea how hard that would be. And that was back in 2000. And that's when that plus this working in extension where I felt I was doing the same experiment over and over again, and it in this case, the nutrient management people who were supporting that kind of research were funding the same experiment over and over again, and we weren't learning anything new. And I'm like, I'm not going to do another rate experiment for potassium until I know that I can capture greater value than just explaining what happened. And I started to think about that. And yes, I did think about the Corcoran Collaborative, and it was because of personal experience where I had a question, a medical question, and I found this thing, and I was like, wow, this is cool. I can get an analysis on which procedure one ought to consider if you have this strange disease. And so it was totally unrelated that piece came into it for me. So I'll let others address more questions if you have thoughts.
So I can't speak for ARS, really. But I think that the concern that you have comes right back to what Sylvie said. The incentives in ARS are just like the incentives in academia, and people are rewarded for publishing papers, not for publishing data. And we're working to
Or doing good experiments and creating.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. So I think part of what has changed is the technology. It's now a lot easier to spin up a repository and also to cite data. There's lots of experience from medical fields where we can see how people have done this before and how it's actually beneficial. So I can say, when I first got into this data sharing space, it was a paper I published in 2005, and I was actually trying to convince ecologists to share their data.
And ecologists are ahead of anger.
And they're ahead, yeah, but still behind medical. So in that time, I guess it's been almost 15 years now, I do see a sea change. And partly I think it's because of this generation of digital natives who just sort of expect you're going to share everything. That's sort of the default.
Yeah.
We're still catching up on the technology to make it easy. But I'm pretty optimistic that the tide has turned. But the incentives are driven by the powers that be in administrations, and so they're not quite where they need to be, but there's pressure on them now.
Administration, you mean presidential administration?
No, I'm talking, in that case, I'm actually talking more about university bureaucracies, or research organization bureaucracies where, they've got a promotion and tenures process at these universities, and it's hard to convince panelists. But I will say that the funding panels these days, my understanding is that when they're reviewing proposals for projects, they're much more savvy than they used to be about what happens to the data afterwards, and they will catch people on it if they're proposing to provide data on request, that's no longer sufficient. Most funded researchers have figured out, no, there's better places to put your data than to do all that one-off time and effort when somebody asks. So I'm pretty optimistic. And then about seed banks, I just want to say, not only is it a good analogy, it's actually connected. So one of the most popular databases that ARS provides is the global data about what's in our seed banks. And that is actually an extremely valuable digital resource. And as a library, sitting on all this paper, but also doing our best to turn it to be digital, I see these things as connected. The physical objects become more valuable as the data about those objects becomes available for people to work with.
I just wanted to make one other point about why now. And I think when you have that kind of image of like some big brother looking at all this data and making sure that it's all together and searchable, I imagine that you're thinking only of the stuff that gets published, right? Like there's no one making sure that like a graduate student's notebook, that data
No,
is.
I meant that.
Oh, you meant that too?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, forget that then. But in terms of the stuff that is out sort of in the more or less public domain, there is now beginning to be technology that can read all of that and index it. So while I was saying earlier that I'm not so confident that we're going to capture some of the unpublished stuff that's happened, at the very least, some of the new technologies, the machine learning kind of reading software that there is now is actually really cool and very sophisticated. And the more of this public published data that they have, the more insights they can find between the papers and start putting together analyses, basically. And that's really neat. No, you need that little red.
I know my red thing isn't on, and I don't know how to turn it on. And I don't want to continue to dominate this conversation, so.
This works.
The 3 dots. 1 of the 3 lines. Yeah, down the list.
Okay, thank you.
This is really fascinating as I'm listening on. My name is Nick Shuckey. I'm the Director of Programs and Engagement at Spark, and we're an advocacy organization that focuses on sort of setting the default open for sort of research articles, data, educational materials. And so it's really interesting to hear sort of a specific agricultural perspective on open data and open research more widely. And I just wanted to say, we'd love to continue the conversation with you all about advocating for stronger policies. We are a library membership organization, and there's a very active conversation among libraries about switching collections budgets over time to go from paying to bring outside resources in and primarily form subscriptions, to flipping to pay for the research that's produced on even campus to be made open from the beginning. And so we're trying to help our members navigate that conversation and hopefully free up budgets that were once going towards subscriptions to create a sustainability model for not just open infrastructure, but open infrastructure that's sort of community owned and community aligned. So we don't recreate the problem in the subscription publishing market, where the main priority is really corporate interests. And then finally, we're really excited about the National Academies Roundtable that was just convened, this, I guess, earlier this month, or the very tail end of last month, around realigning incentives for open science. And I hope that, or optimistic that might help create healthier incentives to address many of the questions that were raised by this panel around actually rewarding the sharing and documentation goes into that, not just making data accessible but also usable. So really enjoyed everything, and hope you continue the conversation.
Comments?
No, I am familiar a little bit with Spark because I have worked now closely ever since I wanted to put my data in the libraries with my friendly librarians. And so I think what, again, this speaks to trying to coordinate the landscape of who's working on what and how can we, how can everybody be elevated by this from the perspective of making science useful.
Can I chime in on that? Because I wanted to actually respond to your frustration that it seemed as though biomedicine has all this industry and all this money that they can do stuff. Well, actually, the ag has opportunity as well, because there's actually, my original, well, maybe not my original, but along my pathway, I was in the biodiversity realm, where you could find people who thought it was important and cool, but there was no industry, really. And so when I came over to ag, and I discovered, wow, there's huge amounts of business investment going into ag, and there's farmers who care because they want to make money and they're trying to feed people. There's a lot of opportunity, I think, for public-private partnerships that we haven't really tapped in, and the challenge is balancing those economic interests of industry with the common good and the public interests of the science.
I think as just an FYI, you probably recall that, or maybe you didn't because it was in the proposal stage, but we had this discussion, should this just be about public data or should we go into big data public-private partnerships? And at that time it was to say, no, let's just talk about, this is a commentary, let's just talk about public ag research's problems and potential solutions, but the whole sphere of how do you interface it with private and what are the opportunities there, I think is huge. And I don't know whether there's another commentary still coming out on that one or
We have a
not.
proposal. I think that we want to get this one out and see if there are still people that have energy to pursue that one.
Cindy does.
Dan, you had another question. Now you know how to turn the mic on.
I know how to turn the mic on. I thought of an incentive. Why, first let me ask you this. We're talking about universities and publicly funded research centers, yes? In this conversation in general. Well, why would you not put a contingency in the grant document that said if you don't at the end of your study share this data, you're not going to get another grant, or you won't get this grant. That's an incentive.
It is, and it's actually, this is part of this changing policy landscape.
Yeah.
So this year, NIFA, most of the NIFA grants that are being given will have that in the terms and conditions, and it was in the request for proposal. So this is part of, you know, the change. NSF has had it for a while, NIH has had it for a little while, now it's made it to ag finally, and we've helped propose that language, but that's only part of it, you know.
Right.
Yes, the expectation will be there. They're going to have to be held to account and not get the next grant if they don't do it. These are all changing practices from the funding side of things that they're going to have
They're
to be watching for
institutional,
that. Yeah.
changes.
Other questions, comments?
Yeah. There's my feeling is that there's a very progressive and positive underlying thesis in this conversation. This data is all constructive. You discover things, and that's going to help somebody do something else. If we only knew that it was there, and now let's try to do that. What about data that hurts something? What if you discover data that nobody really wants to have exposed? How do you handle that? Goes right up on the website with everything else?
So are you talking about data that people have privacy or ethical concerns with, and
Any concern, any reason
Well, I
whatsoever
think
that
the whole
scientific
issue of-
discovery process produces a result that some vested interest doesn't want to share with the public, and the vested interest could be the university itself for some reason.
Well, and I think we see that going on right now, which is, and why we have in medicine the need to disclose who funded you, because if your finding seems to be somewhat partial or biased, and you're funded by the entity that benefits, then there's a need to think about whether or not this is fully representative of the situation. So I can, you know, I think that I mean, I struggle with this a little bit because science, when you discover something, there's probably somebody who's going to benefit and somebody who might not benefit. You know, if we develop a new way of being more efficient with fertilizer, well, the fertilizer industry will lose sales. That's pointed out to me all the time, as you know, they don't want to do that. But at the same time, they get a stewardship profile benefit from doing that, and maybe that will come into play in the future. You get a stewardship something or other that goes with this added value with better use of your product. So I'm not really sure that you know. So somebody, this comes up all the time with farmer data. Will their data be used to regulate them? They don't want to share their data, so they don't want to share their phosphorus application data because they don't want to have somebody to come in and regulate. Well, what?
Or have a lawsuit against them.
Or have a lawsuit against them. And so but these are not new circumstances. People don't want their private medical data released because they don't want to lose their insurance benefit coverage for a pre-existing condition. So I think that there are ethical concerns that have to be addressed, but it's not as if, as we go into it with ag, that there are not a whole lot of efforts out there that point the way to how we solve some of these problems. So that's a somewhat partial answer. Anybody else want to weigh in on that one?
Well, it's a slightly different circumstance, but the Food Safety Inspection Service, in the course of its inspecting for meat, poultry during processing, takes a number of samples, and they asked the Academy at one point, should we publish the results of these? They were looking for E. coli, salmonella. So, like it or not, there's a certain amount of salmonella that's allowed to have in our food system, that we expected is going to be there. And so, anyway, the committee that did this report said, yes, you should publish this stuff. And would be processing specific. In other words, companies would be named. And the companies were saying, like, this, no good is going to come of this. Someone's going to see that we have 3 instances of salmonella, and they're going to take it out of context. So there was a recommendation that the agency work to provide context for the data as a trusted authority on the ones that collected. This is not company collected data. This is data that the government collected. So, maybe when there are questions of sort of public interest, there are groups that do, I was thinking of one organization that does synthesis on ecological questions, or it was in Santa Barbara, the NCAS, which doesn't produce data, it looks at data and synthesizes and tries to answer questions and creates tools for doing so, but maybe those kind of questions will have to be taken up by research groups that try just to answer questions around data that has implications for negative consequences, just to parse them out. So I don't know.
So I actually took the question to be more about what if I discover a new pathogen that I'm too stupid to understand, but maybe people can get my data and now they can piece it together, like the smallpox example. People working on things that you may not want them to know, or you might not even know what you're discovering, but in aggregate, you could have a real big mess on your hands. I mean, I think it's exciting to think about all the benefits that could happen with information sharing, but I think we're also seeing things tip the other way, where walls are going up internationally or otherwise to try to prevent the flow of data because people understand how whatever feels about me or my farm or whatever, and I don't know. This is stuff I'm seeing, so I'm a consultant, but I see this coming more and more. Questions about who has the data and where it can go.
I mean, there are two aspects of this. One is kind of the dual use issue,
exactly.
right? Where maybe someone comes up with an antibiotic or something, but then in that research you figure out a way to get around that antibiotic, or there could be potential. I mean, it's tough because on the one hand, all science is like that.
Exactly.
You can use it. How do you say that any science is completely innocuous? It's tough, and yet we do have federal guidelines for what kinds of information is of either public health or national security concerns. Research on, for example, diseases. Generally speaking, the researchers who uncover new things about, for example, really scary agricultural or human pathogens, or who are doing experiments on this, they already know that there's potential there. I think it's a very unusual case that a researcher might turn something up and then years later it'd be, oh, this got into the wrong hands. I think that's less common. Okay, so dual use. The other, oh man, I wish I'd written it down. The other thought you had, can you repeat? It was about.
I don't even know. Maybe I was going out right there. It's just
Was that what you were talking about?
the
Dual use. Okay, I had another interpretation for maybe what you were saying, but if that was it then.
No, I think that's a definite problem.
Oh, the other was the farmer data.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. So
PII of any type of.
Right, and I mean this is why it's so difficult to get agricultural data. I mean, I joke that it's easier to get HIPAA protected data than farmer data.
Probably.
I think it is.
Because it's layered up by law.
Exactly.
And
And farmers have been burned, in the past and why would they? What benefit is it to them? And I think there is a case to be made for farmers to either aggregate, some way to get that private sector data into the scientific community, at the very least, in a way that they can draw conclusions, maybe without all of the signifiers, in the same way that the medical community has protected information. It's very challenging to do this on a small scale, and most ag research is done very small scale. But it's very financially intensive to have it on a much larger scale too, and to get all of that buy-in from farmers that are not used to sharing that kind of data. So on the one hand, I think it has a lot of promise, and I definitely think the ag world can learn something from the medical community about how to protect the data. On the other hand, I don't think it's right around the corner.
And I think that's also why, you know, one of the reasons we explicitly stayed away from considering the fusions of public and private is that the premise and is much different when you start thinking about someone who has data that they're concerned about. When I'm getting a grant, you know, I check off up front are there national security concerns to my NRIGHT study, these kinds of things. And so, to the best of my knowledge, if I'm doing something and our universities review it that has consequences for national security, and I'm in a big engineering school, there are people who are doing things that have consequences, and that is a different. What open access would look like for that eventually is an entirely different precedent. The reward system is also different. You're working in secret at a lab, and so there are mechanisms that are there, but we're talking about I think a vast amount of data and experimentation that, for the most part, people wouldn't, anticipate pain and suffering as a direct result from the research that they're doing. Although maybe that's not quite correct when you look at some of the things that are out there. But
so I just want to add that the policies to require data to be open by default explicitly mention national security and PII as exceptions.
Yeah.
So the whole idea of the data management plan is, if you're doing that kind of research, you say, I'm doing that kind of research,
you're in a different spot.
And that gets signed off on by the funding agency, so that everybody knows you're not expected to share that. In fact, you're required to protect it. So,
but you also are required to keep to essentially have it be fair. So if there is a question of reproducibility of something that eventually makes it into the public sphere, you can prove it. And if not, you're going to get a little review at the institutional level, which nobody will be happy about.
Are we out of time?
One last one.
Okay. This discussion has been about data in the United States. Canada has data.
Oh, we had a Canadian on we had a Canadian on our task force.
Oh, yeah. Really?
Yeah.
The Netherlands has an amazing, Germany. So is there something going on above the national level to try to do this internationally?
yes, absolutely. There is a group called the Research Data Alliance, which is an international organization that has representatives from all of these countries, and they have 2 plenaries a year, and the next plenary is at the beginning of April in Philadelphia. So if you want to go drive up north for a couple hours, you can actually see, it's a huge thing. I think 800 people from around the world all talking about this kind of stuff.
And there are entities also like Agri-Semantics. You were the one who raised
Yes.
it. So organizations trying to foster coordination amongst efforts in Europe, efforts in the U.S.
Right. FAO is very involved.
FAO, the Food and Ag Organization. So there are a sort of umbrella efforts layered on.
And in some cases Europe is ahead of us as far as the policy, and in other cases we're forging ahead with the technology solutions anyway. So we're all talking to each other, and it does get a little artificial when the science itself might not necessarily have boundaries, but the policies do. So it's tricky, but we are all talking to each other. At least I think the scientists are talking with their colleagues in other parts of the world, and then also those of us who are at government agencies are also doing the same.
Thanks.
Well, let's give our panel and Sylvie another round of applause. Appreciate. Apologize for the late start, but apologize. Thank you for all for coming tonight and be a part of it. If anybody would like additional copies of the paper, I have plenty back there to take